In 1837, a particularly rich asshole named John Simpson, who in fact doesn't matter all that much, waltzed into a town and constructed a sawmill for the sole purpose of making money. And no one seemed to care, because about 20 years earlier a slew of Irish immigrants from New York had done something similar, resulting in the foundation of Meadowvale Village. I made a video about this place before, and if it wasn't painfully obvious for you, it was for me that the clock of history for Mississauga began in the 18th century, because clearly there were, mathematically speaking, at least 1800 years before we started recording Canadian heritage. And a lot can happen in 1800 years, and in fact a lot did happen, because you see, even before North America was discovered in the late 14th century, and even before the first French colony was founded in the 17th century, people were already living here. So many people, in fact, that I can't call them by any one name without being cancelled on Twitter. The people who lived here first had countless tribes and collectives that formed the First Nations on the continent, but to the European settlers they were all just Indians. Even though they weren't in India, they looked nothing like Indians, and an actual group of Indians would come a few hundred years later, but I digress. So the question becomes, where were they? In my video about Meadowvale Village, I made no mention of any previous Indigenous residents in the area. I, like many others, fell victim to the misconception that they had already left. The land the new immigrants settled on was uninhabited and just waiting for a good white man of strong moral character who was capable of proving up the homestead. But it takes a very small amount of research to clarify that this was not the case. And to show you what actually happened, I'm going to walk you through a timeline of what actually happened throughout the years. Actually, I want to talk about something before we move any further. Most of the recorded history comes from the British perspective, probably because Indigenous tradition is predominantly oral and not kept on paper, and more probably because that side of history was actively suppressed through the enforcement of residential schools. But regardless of how it happened, recorded interactions between the Indigenous First Nations and the British Crown always refer to the ceding of land as a treaty, or even sometimes as a purchase. Now, this might just be due to my amateur diligence at historical research, but I can never find a price for these purchases, nor can I understand what the First Nations ever got out of these treaties. Almost always, the treaties only mention what land was given to the Crown, and never mentions what the First Nations got in return, which, if you ask me, doesn't sound a lot like a treaty. Like if someone broke into your house and, holding you at gunpoint, decided they were going to live in your basement. Then periodically they would demand control of your kitchen in return for not shooting you in the head. Then they would repeat that process until you no longer lived in your house. Most people wouldn't call that a treaty. They would call it being a Palestinian. But regardless of what you call it, these land grabs are what marked the demise of Indigenous people in Canada. And I'll let a video from Heritage Mississauga explain how that happened.
By the 1790s, the British Crown recognized that the Mississaugas controlled a large amount of land at the western end of Lake Ontario, and on early maps this area became known as the Mississauga Tract.
And I'm going to stop you right there, because from the same organization, their website claims they established themselves on the north shore of Lake Ontario between 1700 and 1720. Which is also incorrect, because as we discussed before, they had been living off the land for hundreds of years prior. But continuing the quote, during the American Revolution, the British Crown began purchasing large tracts of land for incoming loyalists. The first land purchase involving the British Crown and the Mississauga Nation was in 1781. By 1800, all that remained of the Mississauga's territory was the Mississauga Tract. So to be clear, the Mississauga Tract didn't just appear out of nowhere. The British Crown made it. It didn't symbolize the land Indigenous people had, it signified what land they had left. But let's get back to the video.
The Crown entered into a series of negotiations with the Mississaugas to acquire this tract for settlement. At the end of July of 1805, representatives of the British Crown convened a meeting with the principal chiefs of the Mississaugas at the mouth of the Credit River. The Crown was represented by Colonel William Klaus, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
Note here that William Klaus isn't an ambassador or envoy of the First Nations. He's a Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs. The British didn't see the First Nations as a sovereign state. They saw them as a collection of individuals to be controlled and removed, and they clearly had the legal infrastructure aimed in that direction.
And other officials and officers of the 49th Regiment of Foot. The Mississaugas were represented by their principal chiefs and a gathering of warriors. The conference was held outside and lasted for several days. The chiefs of the Mississaugas understood that the Crown wished to purchase land from them, and while they were wary of relinquishing too much of their territory, they also looked to protect their interests in regards to oncoming settlers. Eventually, the Mississaugas ceded to the Crown's request for territory. The Crown and the Mississaugas signed Treaty 13A on August 2nd of 1805. Often referred to as the Mississauga Purchase, this treaty gave control of over 70,000 acres of land to the Crown, involving all lands from the Etobicoke Creek to Burlington Bay to an approximate depth of 6 miles from the waterfront. The southern part of the city of Mississauga, from Lake Ontario to Eglinton Avenue, is located within this area. The Mississaugas reserve rights to the fishery of the Credit River, along with 1 mile on each side of the river. This area became known as the Credit Indian Reserve.
So, to spell it out, the British Crown started taking land sometime during the mid-17th century, then continued to do so in the 18th century, and in return promised to let the Indigenous people keep the river and a bit of the land near it.
In August of 1818, the Crown and the Mississaugas signed Treaty 19, which ceded 648,000 acres of land, all lands north of modern Eglinton Avenue.
And this is the treaty I really want to talk about, because if you remember, Meadowvale Village was founded in 1819, meaning the land wasn't uninhabited, it was only just recently evicted. Now whether or not the new settlers knew that is anyone's guess, but the point to be made here is that the clock of history for Meadowvale Village shouldn't start in 1836, because it's clear a lot happened before that. But that history doesn't paint the village in a very bright light. The headline, "Mass Eviction of Indians," isn't exactly something to be proud of. Unless you're Doug Ford. Now, I could end the video right here, but I think now, more than ever, it's important we understand the whole picture. If you spent any time consuming news media in any form, you'll have no doubt heard of the 215 Indigenous children found on the site of a residential school. From those of you outside of Canada, and even for those within, this was shocking and tragic news. But within the realm of Canada, the news was less shocking than it was tragic, because it was always an open secret in Canada. Something everyone knew and maybe even joked about, but never talked about openly or seriously. The Canadian Indian reservations are infamous for their lack of clean water and food, insufficient healthcare, and oppressive policing, among many other things. I could spend the rest of this video talking about all the terrible ways we, to this current day, control and manipulate people of Indigenous origin into living lives that could easily be classified as second-class citizens. But the point I need to make is that very little progress has been made from the days of those so-called treaties. So let's return to those treaties and see what crude behavior I'm talking about.
And in February of 1820, Treaties 22 and 23 were signed, and the Crown acquired the reserve lands which had been set aside in 1805.
So the land they had promised to the First Nations they took back 2 years later with no mention of where the Indigenous people went. Honestly, I'd be mad, but then this part of the video comes along.
Can you hear the water? Can you feel the land? Can you smell that air? Could you imagine 200 years ago what my people, the Mississaugas and New Credit First Nation, felt when they were here? As I stand here today and feel the relationship with the water, with the land, and with my territory, I can feel my ancestors walking about and feeling grateful. 200 years ago, we would have canoes and my people walking along the edge of the waters, fishing, playing, but mostly collecting, because that's what my people did. We respect our mother, the earth. We use everything and anything that we collect, so we walk very softly on her. We give that respect that we need. We would teach respect. We would teach all the 7 grandfathers. Teach the songs, the drumming, the dancing, the regalia. We will do all of those things. And I think that when people come back, my people come back, we get that connection. That's why I love being here in Mississauga. We're not gone. We're very much here. And my people are very much here.
Alright, I'm going to try my best not to be a 14-year-old white girl. I'm not going to be angry on your behalf. If this is how you honor your ancestors, I'm not going to take that away from you. But you can't claim that they're still here. They're not. If they were still here, they would still be here. You wouldn't have to use stock footage of generic Indigenous rituals, you would just do them. This positive narrative mystifies the history of Indigenous people in Canada. It makes them appear compliant, when in fact there was a lot of bloodshed over people who, rightfully so, fought foreign invaders to protect the land they had been living on for generations. Your people are not still here. They died fighting off the French and British. They died in residential schools, and they died on the reserves. But I've been unfair in that I haven't addressed the matter from her perspective. If it's truly the land that's sacred, then I need to take a second look from that perspective.
I give my thanks to Mother Earth, to Creator, Chimigwech.
The Credit Indian Reserve lands along the Credit River were retained by the Crown until March of 1847, when they were put up for public auction. The Credit Mission, also known as the Credit Indian Village, was located on the site of what is now the Mississauga Golf and Country Club.
Okay, so I'm just going to ignore the fact that they auctioned off the land they promised to keep as a reserve, because we literally just saw an example of that and no one is surprised. This is also a reoccurring issue in current times when the government tries to build a pipeline on what's left of the reservation lands. No, the thing I want to talk about is the fact that they turned the reservation lands into a fucking golf course. I'm no spiritualist, but I'm pretty sure a golf course is like the least sacred thing you could do to a plot of land. But sure, whatever, your ancestors are still here, probably playing golf.
The Credit Mission was part of the government's plan to assimilate and settle Native peoples in one area and to allow for settlement on their surrounding lands. The mission was built in 1826 under the direction of Reverend Peter Jones and Colonel James Givens, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
Note the intention of this reserve was a mission directed by a reverend. It's this compliancy between the government and the Catholic Church that led to the creation of residential schools.
The village was located on the high grounds overlooking the Credit River, while the valley lands along the river were cultivated for farming. An early description of the village describes an elevated plateau cleared for farming, with 3 rows of detached cottages among fields surrounded with rail fences. By 1837, the village grew to include some 52 family dwellings, and an estimated 500 acres were cleared for farming. The Credit Mission thrived for more than a decade. But pressure from surrounding settlement, the loss of title to their traditional lands, and a decline in population led the Mississaugas to relocate to the new Credit Reserve in 1847. The Credit Mission village itself eventually vanished.
The efforts to assimilate and relocate Indigenous populations was just a thinly veiled excuse to expel people from their lands. The term white settlement pressure might as well be replaced with the word forced relocation. This cycle would continue indefinitely until we arrived at modern-day reservations. Coming back around to the topic of Meadowvale Village, I can't help but feel I've done a disservice by calling this Canada's heritage. On top of the fact that the village doesn't even matter, as I've claimed before in a previous video, Meadowvale Village is only a fraction of time and a fraction of space that composes the larger history of the Canadian nation. Canada has a history, but Meadowvale Village is just barely a part of it. Canada has a history, and it doesn't begin when the white man shows up on your shore. Canada has a history, and it's not always great, and it's not always easy to look at, but it's one we need to know. We as a nation cannot repent for the sins of our past if we're still committing them today. When we claim Canadian heritage, we need to put that history in context. In order to move forward, we first need to know where we are, where we were, and where we're going. And I hope this video puts into perspective some of the context you've only heard in passing. The path to fulfilling the promises made in those treaties to the First Nations is a long path, and one we haven't walked very far along. But to quote some shitty Chinese proverb, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And apparently the best time to cut down that tree is after 1,000 years and then just a few days before it qualifies for special tree protection regulations. You know, kind of like if you broke up with someone a day before their birthday so you don't have to buy them a gift. Kind of a dick move if you ask me. Really a dick move if you ask my ex-girlfriend. I'm just kidding. I've never been in a relationship. Yeah, not exactly the note I wanted to end on. Probably a better note would be to mention that I'll leave all my sources in the description of this video so you can look through them yourselves, and hopefully research more than I did, because I really only scratched the surface of this history. As I said before, North America is a very large place, and there were a lot of different tribes, so maybe look up near where you live and see if there's a similar story to be told.